Can we indeed finally categorize the location of the uncategorized fractal and trace back its origins? Welcome to Mindspike. As many of you know, the mystery of where in the world the uncategorized fractal actually originated from has been a hot topic ever since its release way back. We've compared it to Rata Sum, Rata 10, and basically anything else that might reasonably resemble Asuran architecture, but to no avail. Well, in comes Heart of Thorns, and with it, numerous new, wondrous, and mysterious locations, one of which turned out to be a never-before heard of Asuran city called Rata Novus. This new city is completely dead though, and empty of all life except for the Chak infestation. The only thing left in the city are clues. Now, I'll borrow some of Reddit user Unitario's early speculations regarding the city here, because he believed and voiced quite an appealing argument for the idea that Rata Novus was indeed the exact same structure as the one we see in the uncategorized fractal. I've left a link down below to his original post for the curious, but in essence, his argument rested solely on the similarities of the architecture. By drawing up the outline of both structures to compare them, he perfectly visualized the expected shapes of both Rata Novus and the uncategorized fractal and showed that they indeed seem to have similar shapes. Now, his argument for the in-game visually differentiating features was that the uncategorized fractal most likely must have been a broken off half of Rata Novus, since he hypothesized that the city had fallen from the sky like you would imagine Rata Sum would be able to. This theory was probably one of the most interesting ones I read in the wake of the Heart of Thorns launch, especially because it involved fractals, so of course I had to dig a little deeper into this. So I dug around in the ruins of Rata Novus to find any clue that would actually support or disprove this theory. Now, what I found wasn't exactly what I asked for. Instead, I found a very dark story. Alright, well, I'll explain that story in a little bit, but first I have to make one fact clear, because apparently Rata Novus was not a flying city like Rata Sum. In fact, Rata Novus was completely buried on the ground for the entirety of its lifespan, which in a way completely debunks this theory that Rata Novus fell and cracked, but it doesn't necessarily exclude it from having a significant role in the mystery of the uncategorized fractal. So the story of Rata Novus actually begins back during the time of the original game, approximately 250 years ago. At the time, Rata Novus had not been built yet, but it was exactly at this time that the first Asurans decided to migrate to the surface, as they were gradually getting pushed out of their homes by what would much later turn out to be the rise of Primordus. With this initial migration came about a very specific Asura known by many names, but we will simply refer to him as Sin. Now, the story of Sin is long and complicated, so I'll cut it very short. This little genius wasn't popular amongst his fellow peers for various reasons, and was thus accused of doing heinous things for which he was trialed and quite unjustly sentenced to 10 years of banishment from Asuran lands. And so he apparently decided to wander into the Maguma jungle, duck himself down, and hid away from his former civilization. It was here that he founded the pillars for what we would later come to recognize as Rata Novus. The great Sin was banished as an attempt to eliminate the competition. However, his story has a fortuitous ending, as the sham of a trial motivated Sin to found the city we reside in today. Sin was, for better or worse, an inspiration to many other aspiring golemonters, or geniuses in general, and so it seems that his efforts out in the jungle attracted a whole lot more Asuras to the now young city, and over time it grew in size, and new leadership took over the city as Sin passed away. Now, we basically don't really know the entire magnitude of the city, since we seem to have basically only stood at the gates to the inner city, so we can't really reliably say exactly how big it is, but it seems to be just about, if not even bigger than Rata Sum, just given the outline of the city, which is quite a feat, really. Anyways, with the story of Sin in mind, we can reliably say that the origins of Rata Novus stem back a good 200-250 years, which isn't exactly that old, especially since it seems to have been abandoned a long time before we even arrive there. Specifically, in the ruins we find a golem who gives us a good approximation of the exact day for which it went dormant. It states that it has been exactly 55,849 days since its last update, meaning this thing went dormant 153 years ago, which places the downfall of Rata Novus at approximately the year 1173 AE, so the city has only flourished for less than 100 years really. So what happened to it exactly? Well, to me, just watching the scene post-mortem seemingly resembles a scene in Alien Isolation or Starship Troopers. Well, it seems that whether Sin intended it or not, the city was built on top of a ley line hub, which meant that the city perhaps unwittingly for a time flourished simply due to the easy access to magical power in the area. This drove the Chak, a bug creature which feeds on ley energy, to slowly work their way closer and closer to the city. The Chak continued to prove resilient. Our surface-based defenses slowed their advances for a time, but it seems we underestimated the Chak's ability to burrow. And so to stop these bugs from drawing closer to the city, a defensive perimeter was established. To seal the weakness in our defenses and prevent the Chak from burrowing into the city, I have established a perimeter of seismic disruptors. Eat that, bugs. This grid covers the entire city, so no one needs to worry about a Chak bursting through the ground, assuming there are no power fluctuations in the perimeter defenses. Well, turns out Chak are quite persistent. Defenses are failing across Rata Novus. The Chak feed on anything with a magical signature, and our power crystal nodes are a prime target. The city is experiencing regular blackouts. Increasing danger from the Chak pushed the Rata Novan Council to consider a migration out of the city, immediately instating a new curriculum. All aspiring crew members are required to pass the service relocation history and culture exam prior to receiving clearings for service crew positions. Study material can be found in the library. Fun fact, this seems to be the exact reason why there are informational holograms all over the city, as well as an achievement tied to the library. Regardless of the council's seemingly well-intended attempt at saving the city's assets and inhabitants, it seems that someone was still working to protect the city at all costs. Researchers are trying to tie our power systems directly into the ley lines. If we can master this technology, it would give us infinite renewable power. Imagine the raw power. This research and decision would turn out to be devastating for the city though. The power surge from the ley line power relay acted like a magnet, drawing in massive amounts of Chak. We're doomed. This will be my final entry. May the alchemy recycle the energy of my soul. First off, I simply have to point this out because it blew my mind to read. Because in relation to the last episode of Mindspike where I talked about souls simply being magic which could be utilized as an energy source, this Asura literally refers to his soul as being energy. Second off, and on topic, it seems that as soon as the Novan researchers hit the ley line, the entire city was overrun by Chak, which busted through their defenses. We've evacuated anyone we could and gathered the remaining power crystals around the console room. That's sure to attract those filthy arthropods. Once they make their move, we will activate every city defense that's still operational and hold out as long as we can. Our calculations conclude this is the only way. The entire city was immediately evacuated, but some were still stuck underground, as one of the previous notes would imply. The Asura who wrote this was himself locked inside a hidden research lab, seemingly dedicated to the study of elder dragons, which we should hear more about in the future, as lore-wise, Tyria is now investigating this specific research. But one thing boggles my mind. Where are all the bodies? Here I'm of course referring to both the dead ones and alive ones. I know that it's been about 150 years since the incident, but I'd still assume there to be survivors or bones lying around the city. I don't presume Chak eat those as well, or what? Well, as I stated before, the majority of the city's inhabitants seem to have been evacuated. The question is, where did they get evacuated to? There's absolutely no trace of the entire population after the incident. Tyria even refers to the city of Rata Novus as a legend, a myth, something that possibly never existed, yet we see it here, and we're told that at least a part of the civilization should have been saved, yet there's literally no sign of them. Now, I realize that I may be too hasty to put a thought like that forward, given the fact that we haven't actually had a look inside the inner city, but nonetheless, if any of them survived, you'd at least expect some tale somewhere of a survivor from Rata Novus, right? So the sole question regarding Rata Novus is, what exactly happened to the evacuated citizens after the last log entry. For this, let's return to the subject of the uncategorized fractal for a second here. We know basically nothing about it except for a few lines of weird dialogue from the Raving Asura and from Dessa. According to the Raving Asura, it seems that the structure we know as the uncategorized fractal did indeed suffer from a breach. Something broke through their defenses, which caused the city to fall. This is, of course, a loose interpretation from a very cryptic message.
I couldn't save them. I heard them all pleading. All
replenishing.
Gone. All on my watch. Breach, broken, falling, screaming, dying.
It would seem that the Raving Asura's job had been to protect his comrades, yet he failed them, unfortunately, causing all of them to perish. That is about all we know of his situation. Now, humor me here for a second. Let's hypothesize for a moment that the structure of the uncategorized fractal was indeed maneuverable, like we would imagine that Rata Sum could take off and locate itself somewhere else. Then the similarities between the events of Rata Novus and the uncategorized fractal could indeed seem like two sides of the same story. This idea would portray a scenario wherein the Raving Asura would attempt to save the entire civilization from their impending doom by trying to lift off Rata Novus from its underground location and fly off, but he failed, causing the entire city to crash back into the ground, forever buried in the jungle. That could indeed explain the many roots poking out of the uncategorized structure as well. There's only one thing. This cannot possibly have happened because, first off, the technology utilized in the uncategorized structure is years off of what we see in Rata Novus. Just look at the golems for one. The golems we see in Rata Novus use power cores which are hundreds of years old, whereas the ones we see in the fractal are brand spanking new and modern to our standards. And secondly, Dessa. See, because we now have the answer to one of Dessa's most cryptic lines of dialogue throughout the entire fractal experience. As you enter the uncategorized fractal, this is what Dessa says.
Planet, I need to go. I'm sorry.
For a long time, we've been wondering why she suddenly feels the need to leave the scene without much explanation. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's because we now have concrete evidence that the Raving Asura is indeed Dessa's long-lost boyfriend. We know this because if you now go and unlock the precursor collection for the legendary shortbow, the Dreamer, when you reach the end of the uncategorized fractal, in the chest of the Raving Asura, you will now find a love letter to Dessa, presumably from the Raving Asura himself, which would explain Dessa's emotional reaction upon seeing what we might presume to be her boyfriend's final resting place, or perhaps a form of prison. Now, why would I say prison? Well, we know that Dessa's boyfriend was, according to Dessa herself, taken by the Consortium. Now, we've never actually figured out where, why, or if they actually took him, but something must have happened to him, right? And what better way to test an early fractal concept than to test it on someone? For all we know, perhaps Dessa is simply blaming the Consortium for forcing Dessa herself to test it on her boyfriend, or perhaps she's just blaming them as a way of getting rid of her own guilt for what she did to her boyfriend. Either way, if we are to put the Consortium into the equation of the relation between the uncategorized fractal and Rata Novus, I guess we can, to a fairly safe degree, say that the Consortium are a much younger corporation than, say, the 150 years that has passed since Rata Novus was destroyed, thus rendering the theorized connection between the two redundant. But as I've discussed in an earlier video on the fractal conundrum, since I believe that Dessa is stuck in a closed time-like curve, or what we might now reliably call a singularity, a single point in time and space where time doesn't exist for others than yourself, this would mean that she could have possibly existed at a completely different time than the Consortium, and so the only thing the Consortium would have to do was to find a way to enter her reality. Now imagine that whatever event caused Dessa to get stuck in this singularity was the exact same thing which caused the uncategorized fractal, and with it the Raving Asura to be stuck in its own singularity, meaning Dessa's work might literally have leveled an entire city and sent it into the rift. Now, this is where we get really far out, so prepare your tinfoil hats, because this would mean that if this is true, then the uncategorized fractal could actually be the city of Rata Novus, which would have then survived the initial evacuation from the Chak. Now, if we overanalyze immensely, perhaps what Dessa was initially trying to create was a way to save the city by making a jump through time and space, but instead of saving the city, she ripped off a huge chunk of Rata Novus, banishing it to forever be stuck in the rift. This in turn would mean that the Raving Asura was perhaps not trying to save the citizens from the Chak, but he was perhaps trying to save them from Dessa. But where would that leave the Consortium then? Because we know for a fact that they are part of this whole thing. If this were to be true, then the Consortium would have had to find a portal to both singularities, and perhaps then decided to keep the Raving Asura hostage to make Dessa work for them. But this is where we start to get too far out into pure ungrounded speculations. Another huge discrepancy in this theory is obviously the jump in technology between the two structures. It's undeniable to anyone that that would be a huge loophole, though this might be explained by the idea that the city actually survived much longer than just the immediate aftermath of the evacuation, and that the city had then simply hovered above ground for several years. It's an idea, but a far out one at best. I fully acknowledge that. For what it's worth, I'm not even entirely sure that I believe it to any degree, but it's definitely a possibility to consider. Personally, I'm just really looking forward to possibly entering the Rata Novan inner city area to get some answers cleared up and possibly reevaluate this theory. Either way, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on the matter. What do you think we might find inside the city? Is it just a huge laboratory for dragon research, or is there even more to it? And how do you feel about the reveal of the love between Dessa and the Raving Asura? Tell me in the comment section down below. But for now, that's all I have for you guys this time. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, I will see you in the mists.